People think the fear comes at night. They imagine it arrives in the dark, sometime after midnight. When the house settles and the pipes murmur and the silence grows large enough to notice. That's what they picture when they ask me, gently, carefully, as if the question itself might bruise me. Aren't you afraid to live alone? They say, and I always tell them the same thing. The night is not the problem. The night, in its way, is honest. It makes no promises. It asks nothing of you except that you lie still and listen. No, the fear, when it comes in the morning. It comes at 6:12 a.m. when you open your eyes and realize there is no one in the next room. It comes when you swing your legs over the side of the bed and feel, very precisely, the weight of your own body as something you must carry by yourself. It comes when you stand in the kitchen holding a kettle and think, if I dropped this, if I slipped, if I didn't get back up right away, how long would it be before someone noticed? That is the question people don't ask out loud. They dress it up in softer language. They call it safety. They call it care. They call it options. I am 91 years old, and I have lived alone for 7 years in a house. That is too large for me and yet fits me better than anywhere else I have ever been. I know where the floorboards creak and which cupboard sticks in humid weather. I know the exact angle of afternoon light in October when it reaches the back wall of the sitting room and turns. Everything the color of old honey. This house knows me, and I know it. That is not a small thing, though people will try to convince you that it is.
My daughter tried, in her way. She is a good woman, my daughter. Thoughtful, practical, the kind of person who plans ahead, which has served her well in life and occasionally made her impatient with those of us who do not. It began, as these things do, with a conversation that pretended to be casual. She called on a Wednesday afternoon and asked how I was managing. Managing is a word people use when they already suspect the answer. I told her the truth. I said I was fine, not perfect, not effortless, but fine. And there was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind that fills with everything a person is choosing not to say. A week later, she came to see me. She brought groceries I had not asked for, and a tone of voice that was just a little too careful. We sat at the kitchen table, and she watched me the way you watch something fragile, something you're afraid might break if you look away for too long. And then she said it. Not all at once, not bluntly, but it was there beneath every word. Maybe it's time to think about something safer, she said. Safer. It is a persuasive word. It sounds like kindness. It sounds like protection. But what it often means, though no one says it this way, is smaller. Smaller choices, smaller days, smaller versions of yourself. I have lived a long time, long enough to recognize when a word is doing more work than it appears to be doing. She told me about places I could go, bright places, clean places, places where someone would always be nearby. She told me about schedules and services and how I wouldn't have to worry anymore. And I listened, because listening is something you learn if you want to keep people close to you. But while she spoke, I found myself looking at the window above the sink, at the small crack in the corner that Gerald always said he would fix and never did. And I thought, worry is not the worst thing in the world. There are worse things than worry. What she did not say, though it sat between us the entire time, was this: what if something happens and you are alone when it does? That is the fear, not loneliness. Not really. Loneliness, you can learn to live with. It changes shape over time. It becomes quieter, less demanding. Sometimes it even becomes a kind of companion. But helplessness, that is different. That is the fear people are trying to solve when they suggest you leave your home. And so they offer you a trade. They do not call it that, but it is one. They offer you safety in exchange for control. They offer you supervision in exchange for privacy. They offer you company in exchange for the right to decide, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, that you will have your tea at 4 instead of 3 simply because you feel like it. I want you to understand something clearly, especially if you are not yet old enough to have had this conversation forced upon you. Independence is not a grand, dramatic thing at my age. It is not about big decisions or bold adventures. It is about the accumulation of very small choices. It is about when you wake up and what you eat, and whether you sit in the chair by the window or the one near the door. It is about the rhythm of your own life, unobserved and uninterrupted. The first time I visited one of those places, I remember noticing how cheerful everything was. The walls were painted in soft colors. There were flowers on the tables that no one seemed particularly interested in. A television murmured in the corner, and a group of people sat in chairs arranged in a circle that suggested conversation without quite achieving it. A young woman with a bright smile showed me around and spoke to me in a voice that was just slightly louder than necessary, as though volume might compensate for something else. She showed me a room. "This could be yours," she said, and I stood there, looking at the bed that was not mine and the window that did not open the way I would have liked. And I had a very clear thought: if I come here, I will be safe. And if I come here, I will begin, slowly and politely, to disappear. I did not say that out loud. There are many things you learn not to say out loud as you get older, not because they are untrue, but because they make other people uncomfortable. Instead, I smiled. I asked questions. I nodded at appropriate moments. And when we left, my daughter looked at me with hope that she was trying to hide. And I felt something in my chest that was not anger and not quite sadness, but something close to both. If you are afraid to live alone, I understand that fear. I do. I have felt it myself in quiet moments, when the house seemed too still and the future too uncertain. But I am going to tell you something that people may not tell you, not because they are lying, but because they have not lived long enough to know the difference. The answer to fear is not always to remove yourself from it. Sometimes the answer is to change the way you stand in relation to it, because there is another way to live alone that is not the same as being alone. And that difference, small as it may seem from the outside, is the difference between a life that is managed and a life that is still, stubbornly, your own. The mistake people make is thinking that living alone is a condition when, in truth, it is a structure, and like any structure, it can be reinforced, reshaped, or quietly allowed to collapse depending on how you tend to it. When my daughter left that evening after showing me those bright, careful places, I did not make a decision right away. I have never trusted decisions made too quickly, especially the ones that come wrapped in urgency and concern. Instead, I made tea. I sat in my chair, the green one by the window, and I watched the light change the way I have watched it change for years. Slowly, without asking anything of me, I paid attention. That is the first thing no one tells you. They tell you to be practical, to be sensible, to think about risks and contingencies and all the things that sound important because they are measurable, but they do not tell you to pay attention to your own life as it is actually being lived, not the version that exists in other people's worries, but the one that unfolds in your hands each day. The next morning, I woke up at 6:12, as I always do. I stood in the kitchen with the kettle and asked myself a different question. Not what might happen if I fall, but what is already happening if I leave. The answer came quietly, without drama. If I leave, I give up the unnoticed freedoms that make up the shape of my days. I give up the particular way my life fits around me. And once given up, those things do not return. That does not mean you ignore the risks. I am not a foolish woman. Despite what my daughter occasionally suspects, I know my hands are less steady than they once were. I know stairs are not the simple things they used to be. I know that BAFTAs, especially old ones, have a way of surprising you at inconvenient moments. But there is a difference between acknowledging risk and surrendering to it. So I began, not with a grand plan, but with small adjustments. That is the second thing people misunderstand. They think the alternative to leaving your home must be some clever, complicated system. It is not. It is a series of small, deliberate choices that, taken together, change the way your life holds you. I moved the things I used most often to where I could reach them easily. The good plates stayed where they were, because I liked them there, but the everyday ones came down to a lower shelf. I bought a kettle that switches off on its own, not because I am incapable of remembering, but because I see no virtue in unnecessary risk. I placed a chair in the hallway where there had never been one before, so that if I felt unsteady, I would not have to pretend otherwise. These are not dramatic acts. No one applauds them. No one even notices them unless they are looking very closely, but they matter. They are the difference between a life that adapts and a life that waits to be interrupted. Still, adjustments inside the house are only part of the answer and not the most important part. The deeper question, the one that sits beneath all the practical concerns, is this: who knows you are here? Not in theory, not as an entry in a phone book or a name on a list. Who, in the actual, physical world, would notice your absence in a way that matters? For a long time, my answer to that question was unsatisfactory. My daughter knew, of course, but she lives an hour away. and her life is full in ways that leave little room for spontaneous noticing. We spoke regularly, but regularity is not the same as presence. I had acquaintances, people I nodded to on my walks, people who might recognize me if we passed in the street, but recognition is not the same as connection. This is where most people turn back. This is the point at which the fear feels justified, even sensible. You see, they say, this is exactly why you shouldn't be alone. And they are not entirely wrong. Being invisible in your own life is a dangerous thing, but the conclusion they draw that the only solution is to relocate yourself into a system designed to monitor you is not the only conclusion available. There is another option, though it requires something that has become surprisingly rare: the willingness to reach outward without a guarantee of return. The first time I did it, it felt almost absurd. It was a Tuesday, late morning, and I had just come back from the end of the street, where I go each day to remind my legs that they still belong to me. On my way back, I noticed the house 2 doors down had its curtains open for the first time in months. Someone new had moved in. I had seen a car the day before, unfamiliar, slightly dented on one side. I could have walked past. In fact, I almost did. There are many reasons not to interfere in other people's lives. We have become very good at listing them: privacy, politeness, the fear of being unwelcome, all reasonable, all, in their own way, protective. But I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, and I thought about the question I had asked myself: who knows you are here? And I realized that waiting for the answer to change on its own was not a strategy. It was a hope, and hope, while comforting, is not always reliable. So I did something that felt, at my age, both simple and strangely difficult. I walked up the path and knocked on the door. It was not a dramatic knock. I did not announce myself with confidence or certainty. I knocked the way you do when you are prepared for the possibility that no one will answer. But someone did. A man, perhaps in his 40s, opened the door with the cautious expression of someone who was not expecting company and had not yet decided whether he wanted any. "Yes," he said. "I live just down the street," I told him. I wanted to say hello. There was a pause, brief but noticeable, in which he seemed to consider what this meant, what it might require of him. And then, to his credit, he stepped back slightly and opened the door a little wider. We spoke for less than 5 minutes. Names were exchanged. A few basic facts were offered. He had moved in recently. Work had brought him here. He did not yet know the area. It was, by any measure, an unremarkable interaction. No great connection was formed. No immediate friendship declared, but something shifted, quietly and almost invisibly. Now, if I did not walk to the end of the street for a few days, there was at least one more person in the world who might, at some point, think, "I haven't seen her." It is a small thing, as I said, but small things, when arranged properly, have a way of becoming something larger than themselves. This is what I mean when I say there is another way, not a system imposed from the outside, but a network, built slowly, imperfectly, through ordinary human contact. It does not look impressive. It does not come with guarantees or brochures or smiling staff members who reassure you that everything will be taken care of. What it offers instead is something less certain but, in my experience, far more valuable. It offers the possibility of being seen not as a problem to be managed, but as a person who still exists in relation to others, and that, I have found, changes the nature of fear in a way no locked door or scheduled activity ever could. It did not transform everything at once. I want to be honest about that, because there is a temptation, when telling these kinds of stories, to smooth the edges and present change as something clean and immediate. It was not. The day after I knocked on that door, my life looked almost exactly the same as it had the day before. I still woke up at 6:12. I still stood in the kitchen with the kettle. I still felt, in certain moments, the quiet weight of being the only person in the house. But something had shifted beneath the surface, and shifts like that have a way of accumulating. A few days later, I saw him again, the man from 2 doors down. He was struggling with a large cardboard box at the back of his car, the kind that looks manageable until you actually try to lift it. I recognized the particular expression on his face, the calculation of effort versus pride. So I did what I have learned to do when I recognize that expression. "Would you like a hand?" I asked. He hesitated, just long enough to make it clear that accepting help did not come easily to him. Then he nodded. "If you don't mind." "I don't offer if I mind," I said, which is something my husband used to say, and which I have found remains useful. We carried the box together, slowly, adjusting our grip as needed. It was not efficient, It was not elegant, but it worked. When we set it down inside his doorway, he thanked me with a kind of sincerity that suggested the moment had meant more than the task itself required. "Elias," he said, as though remembering he had not properly introduced himself the first time Cecily. I replied, that was all. No exchange of numbers, no promises to stay in touch, just a name, placed now in a slightly more solid context. If you are listening carefully, you will notice what is happening here. This is not friendship, at least not in the way people tend to define it now. There are no declarations, no immediate intimacy, no expectation that we will become central figures in each other's lives. What is forming instead is something quieter and, in many ways, more durable. Recognition, familiarity, the beginning of a pattern. Patterns matter. They are how human beings make sense of the world. When you see the same face more than once, when you exchange small words over time, when your presence becomes part of someone else's mental landscape, you are no longer entirely alone. Even if you still live by yourself. Around this time, I made another small change, one that would have seemed insignificant to anyone watching from the outside. I adjusted my routine so that I walked not just to the end of the street and back, but around the block. It added perhaps 10 minutes to my day. 10 minutes is not much, unless you are 91, in which case it is something you notice. The first few times, it felt like an effort. My legs complained in the quiet way they have developed over the years, not loudly, but persistently. I considered turning back more than once, but I did not because I am particularly disciplined, but because I had begun to understand that the purpose of the walk was no longer just exercise, it was exposure. On the third day, I passed a woman watering plants in her front garden. She looked up as I approached, and we performed the small, familiar ritual of strangers acknowledging each other's existence. "Morning," she said. "Morning," I replied. The next day, it happened again, and the day after that. By the end of the week, we had progressed to a brief exchange about the weather, which was, as usual, doing something mildly inconvenient. Her name, I learned, was Annika. She had lived on that street for 5 years and had, until recently, assumed that I preferred to keep to myself. "I didn't want to intrude," she said. "I didn't want to impose," I answered. We both smiled at that, recognizing, perhaps, the quiet absurdity of two people maintaining distance out of mutual consideration. This is how isolation sustains itself, not through hostility, but through politeness, through the careful avoidance of inconvenience, through the assumption that other people are less open to connection than they might actually be. Once you see it, you begin to notice it everywhere. I began, slowly, to interrupt that pattern, not dramatically, not in a way that would alarm anyone, but consistently. A slightly longer conversation here, a small question there, nothing that demanded too much, either from me or from them. With Elias, it became a habit to exchange a few words whenever our paths crossed, sometimes about nothing in particular, sometimes about the minor challenges of his work, which I did not fully understand but could appreciate in principle. Once, when I had not seen him for several days, I found myself wondering whether he was well. That thought, simple as it was, marked a change. Concern had begun to move in both directions. With Annika, the conversations grew more comfortable. She told me about her plants, which she cared for with a level of attention I recognized from my own younger years. I told her, once, about the small garden I used to keep in the back, before it became more than I could manage. She offered, without making a performance of it, to bring me herbs when she had more than she could use. "Only if you want them," she added. "I do," I said. And so, a few days later, there was a small bundle of fresh basil on my kitchen counter, placed there after a brief knock on the door, and a short exchange that did not linger longer than it needed to. None of this would impress my daughter. If I described it to her in these terms, it would sound, to her, like very little. A few conversations, a shared task, some herbs passed from one kitchen to another, measured against the structured certainty of a place where someone is always on duty, where help can be summoned with the press of a button. It might even seem inadequate, but what she would not see, unless she were living it, is the way these small interactions begin to weave themselves into the fabric of a life. Now, when I wake up in the morning, the question is no longer only how I will move through the day, but who I might encounter along the way, not with obligation, not with pressure, but with possibility. If I do not walk one morning, there are now at least 2 people who might notice eventually, not immediately, not with alarm, but with a subtle shift in expectation. And if something were to happen, If I were to need help in a way I could not anticipate, there are now doors within a short distance that I could knock on, not as a stranger, but as someone known. This is the difference I want you to understand. Safety, as it is commonly offered, is external. It is something provided to you, managed for you, maintained by systems that operate whether you are fully present within them or not. What I am describing is different. It is relational. It depends on you, yes, but it also depends on others in a way that is mutual rather than one-sided. You are not simply being watched over. You are participating in a network of attention that moves in more than one direction. There are still risks. Of course, there are. I have not become immune to the realities of age simply because I have chosen to stay in my own home. My hands still shake sometimes. My balance is not what it once was. There are moments when I feel the edge of that old fear, the one that asks, quietly but persistently, what if? But that question no longer stands alone. Now, when it appears, it is accompanied by another. Not what if something happens, but what if I am not as alone as I once believed? And that question, I have found, is a steadier thing to live beside. There is a point, if you live long enough, where you stop asking whether life will become easier and start asking whether it will remain yours. That is the question that matters, in the end. Not comfort, not efficiency, not even safety in the way people usually define it, but ownership, the quiet, persistent sense that the life you are living still belongs to you. I did not arrive at that understanding all at once. It came, like most things worth knowing, in pieces. It came one afternoon when I was standing on a small step stool in the kitchen, reaching for a jar I had no real need to reach for myself. I could have asked for help. I could have waited, but I wanted, in that moment, to prove something not to anyone else, but to myself. Halfway through the reach, I felt the slight shift in balance that signals a decision must be made. Continue or stop. 10 years ago, I would not have thought about it. I would have simply continued. At 91, you learn to pay attention to those moments. They are not dramatic, but they are important. I stepped down, not in defeat, not in fear, but in recognition. There is a difference between independence and refusal. One keeps you steady, the other puts you at risk. Later that same day, I mentioned it to Annika when she stopped by with a handful of mint. You could have called me, she said. I could have, I agreed. You should have. I might next time. And that was the end of it. No lecture, no concern stretched into something heavy and unmanageable. Just an acknowledgement that help exists and can be used without turning it into a surrender. This is the balance people struggle to understand. They believe the choice is between doing everything alone and giving everything up. It is not. There is a middle space, though it requires a certain kind of honesty. You must know, or be willing to learn, where your limits are. Not the imagined ones, not the ones imposed on you by others, but the real ones that reveal themselves in quiet moments, like that step stool in the kitchen. Around this time, my daughter visited again. She arrived with the same careful attention, the same quiet inventory of my condition that she tries, unsuccessfully, to disguise. I do not blame her for it. It is, in its way, an expression of love. We sat together in the afternoon, and as we talked, there was a knock on the door. Not unusual anymore. I excused myself and answered it. It was Elias, holding a small package that had been delivered to his house by mistake. Thought this might be yours? He said. It is, I replied. We exchanged a few words, nothing of consequence, and then he left. When I returned to the sitting room, my daughter was watching me with a different expression than the one she had arrived with. Do you know him well? She asked. Well enough, I said. She nodded, and a few minutes later, there was another knock. This time it was Annika, asking if I needed anything from the market. I told her I was fine, but thanked her anyway. She smiled, glanced briefly at my daughter, and went on her way. My daughter was quiet for a long moment after that. This is new, she said finally. Yes, I said. She looked around the room, at the chair I always sit in, at the window, at the small, ordinary details that make up the life she has been trying, for some time, to improve. You seem, she began, and then stopped. I know, I said, because I did know. I knew what she was trying to say because I could feel it myself. Not happiness, exactly. Happiness is too simple a word for something that contains this many layers. But steadiness, presence, a kind of quiet alignment between who I am and how I am living. I was worried, she said. I know that too. And you're not. Afraid. I considered the question carefully. It deserved that. I am, I said. Sometimes. She waited. because she has learned that I do not speak in Hoffensirs. But it's different now, I continued. It's not the kind of fear that pushes me out of my own life. She nodded, slowly, as though adjusting something in her understanding. Before she left that evening, she stood by the door for a moment longer than usual. If things change, she said, you'll tell me. If things change, I said, I'll know. That seemed to satisfy her, or at least to give her something she could carry away with her that was not worry alone. After she left, the house was quiet again. It always is. That has not changed. The evenings are still long. The mornings still arrive with their questions. My hands still shake when I am tired. There are still days when the effort of moving through the hours feels heavier than I would like. But there is also this, a knock on the door that is no longer unexpected, a name called from the garden, a small, ordinary exchange that reminds you that your life extends, however modestly, beyond the walls of your own home. If you are afraid to live alone, I will not tell you that the fear is foolish. It is not. It is, in many ways, a reasonable response to the realities of age and uncertainty. But I will tell you this, because I have lived it and I understand it now in a way I did not before. Do not rush to place yourself somewhere. That solves the fear by removing you from your life. Before you do that, try something else. Make your world slightly larger, not by leaving it, but by opening it. Learn the names of the people who live near you. Offer help when you can, even if it feels small. Accept help when you need it, even if it feels unfamiliar. Allow yourself to be seen, not as a problem to be managed, but as a person still capable of giving and receiving in equal measure. It will not make you invulnerable. Nothing will. At 91, I can tell you that with certainty, but it will make you something else, something that matters just as much, if not more. It will make you connected. And connection, I have found, does not eliminate fear, but it changes its shape. It makes it lighter to carry. It places it in a context that is shared rather than endured alone. I am still here, in this house, in this chair, in this life that is not perfect and not always easy, but still, unmistakably, mine. That, in the end, is what I chose to keep. And for now, that is enough.